Welcome back to the Weekly Rant, the podcast where we deep dive into pressing issues in Israel and the Jewish world. I'm your host, Sean, and each week we'll unpack the latest developments and controversies in Israel and something else. Joining me in my journey is my esteemed guest, Ari Kalka. Together we'll navigate the intricacies of life in Israel, the challenges, the controversies, and the different narratives. If you're passionate about Israel and want to learn more, stick with us. Also, a big thank you to Tamir Dotal and Ala Mashmaut for hosting us in this week's podcast. Ari, it's time to talk about a very, very topical issue in Israel, the Ultra-orthodox draft or the Haredi draft.
All right, let's get into it.
Okay, so I'm going to start with a bit of background. As everyone knows, in Israel, there is a compulsory draft where all citizens from the age of 18 are expected to serve in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. Generally, men serve for about 32 months. That means all men from the age of 18. Women serve for about 24 months. Now, there are a couple of exceptions, and we need to speak about who is eligible to be drafted. So, firstly, all Jews, men and women, are eligible to be drafted. In addition to that, all Druze men, as well as Cherkesim, which is a small subsection of the Israeli Christian community. Now, after your 34 months, most men are also expected to do reserve duty until at least the age of 40 or beyond in the case of you and myself. Within all that, there are also exceptions to the draft. So while we said all men are expected, and we will speak about Haredim in a minute, the exceptions are Druze women, individuals with medical or psychological issues, and people who are, and women who are married are also exempt from military service.
Okay, I think though, before we get into the meat and potatoes of the issue of the Haredi draft, I think there's a very important two other groups of people that generally do not serve in the army that we need to put on the side. Not because it's not an important issue to discuss, it's just not the topic of today's conversation. That is Arabs, Muslim citizens of the State of Israel, and that is the secular Tel Avivi, describe them how you like, population that don't serve. Both of them don't serve almost to the same extent, if not to the same extent, as the ultra-orthodox population. Each one of those is an entire, way more than just one episode of a podcast, is a subject each of in its own right. We are recognizing that they don't serve and that it's also a major problem, and we will discuss them in a separate episode at a later date and time. But for today's episode, we're going to discuss only the Orthodox men who are not serving, because that is the hot topic right now in Israel and the political world.
Thank you. So let's talk about historically. The State of Israel is established in May 1948, and right away, David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, makes an agreement with, at that stage, the tiny ultra-Orthodox community that is living in Israel and the ultra-Orthodox Jewry that is making its way from the ravages of Europe to settle in Israel. And this agreement allows the Haredi population, which at that stage was relatively small, to be exempted from the draft so that their community can grow and maintain its ultra-Orthodox and insular lifestyle. In 1948, this exemption was for a few hundred individuals. And over the last 75 years, this exemption, which initially applied to a small group, has been blanketly applied to the entire ultra-Orthodox.
I think, though, that before we go on, it's really important to point out that there's a couple of historical examples that even within those exemptions, there was the Jerusalem Brigade here in the city of Jerusalem, where there were enormous amounts of the yeshiva students who served to protect the city of Jerusalem. There are other examples in Haifa and elsewhere where with all those exemptions, even then, they felt the personal responsibility and need to still serve and protect.
That is an important caveat to make. With that, I think we're going to move on to the situation we have today, where it may have started off as a few hundred, but today we're talking about an exemption that applies to tens of thousands, or if you look at the entire segment, it's a few 100,000 individuals that are completely exempt from the draft. Now, I want to step back before we get into being analytical or even critical, and I want to try and give the Haredi perspective on this first. I think it's important. So from the Haredi perspective, they started receiving the exemption because it was a way to protect their own lifestyle, and it was important as a way to build up a community that had been ravaged by the Holocaust. So initially, the exemption meant that young men could stay and study Torah, be in a yeshiva presence 24/7, and that would be their entire lifestyle. Second to that also came the idea of not only was it important for the ultra-Orthodox men to be in a kollel or in a study or yeshiva, but it also fit very well with their insular lifestyle. The Haredi and ultra-Orthodox community, especially today, don't have much interaction or don't want much interaction with the outside world. That includes everything from technology. Initially, it was things like television. Today, there's a big discussion about smartphones. But even day-to-day interaction with the outside world isn't necessarily something that they encourage. More importantly, today, there is the political dimension. That after 75 years, the insular Haredi community, both the Ashkenazi and Sephardi community, have created insular, very powerful voting blocks. And it is these voting blocks that ensure the rights and obligations and privileges of the Haredi communities remain, but they're also one of the most important voting blocks in the Knesset, ensuring that the Haredi community can maintain their own lifestyle, and that includes staying away from being drafted into the army. Now, Ari, I'm going to turn it over to you because there's a number of issues we want to unpack, including possibly a few solutions. What does this mean for us? What does this mean for army? And we do have to discuss the economic impact of all of this.
Right. All right. So I think that before we even unpack, as you say, the entire issue itself, we have to break it down. I think there's three fundamental questions that we need to first answer before we can even talk about solutions. I'm going to list them quickly, and we'll delve into each one separately. I think the first question is does the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox community, feel or believe itself to be part of the greater Jewish and Israeli community, and feel the same responsibility to protect the state and country as everyone else does? I think the second question we need to ask is, does the army even need them? From a manpower perspective, is there a real need for the 63,000 plus Haredim that are eligible to be drafted immediately? And I think the last question that we need to ask ourselves is the army capable? Let's say all of them decided tomorrow we're all going to draft. Walk up, we show up at the induction office, draft us all. Is the army even capable technically and practically of drafting and absorbing an entire population that up until this point doesn't serve in a very significant way, at least by volume of soldiers? Those are the three questions that we need to answer first, and only once we delve into those can we really talk about solutions to the issue of the Haredi draft.
The first issue that you raised, fundamental issue that you raised, I think that was an excellent way to start, is do Haredim view themselves as, or how do Haredim view themselves as part of the greater community?
Right. How do they view themselves within the context of the greater Jewish community on a global level, and how they view themselves more specifically for the purpose of our discussion today within the greater Israeli community? Where is their position within the Israeli community? What is the function that they're serving within that community? And what are their responsibilities back towards that community? I would like to approach that question first by talking about the exact opposite of them. I have all my work with lone soldiers over the years through the Lone Soldier Center, and then afterwards on my own. I know of many completely unaffiliated Jews from abroad, mainly from the United States, who grew up without ever experiencing authentic halachic Judaism at any point in their life. But at the age of 18, 19, they feel this tremendous personal responsibility to get on a plane, come to Israel, serve in the army, whether it's as a volunteer through Machal or by making Aliyah and serving more significant army service, mainly almost exclusively in combat units, and fulfilling this responsibility that they feel not only towards the greater Jewish people, but the state of Israel that provides them a home that they either avail themselves of in the future or don't. So my question comes down to, does the Haredi community feel that same shared responsibility towards what we view as the state of Israel, what it is? Like, do they feel that responsibility back to protect it and guard it? Is it something of extreme value to them? Or is it a means to an end? Is it just the state exists as a way to provide financial benefits, some level of security, so that I can continue to grow and flourish within my own community? And I'm not really part of this greater thing called the state of Israel. I'm benefiting from it, but I don't have responsibility for it. I don't have the answer to that question. It's not a community that I'm an integral part of. I don't know. But judging from the way that their community exists currently in the state of Israel, I would be under the opinion that they don't. That they don't feel a shared responsibility towards the state of Israel. From conversations I've had with members of the community, they're comfortable. They can live as second-class citizens under any rule. The Zionist or Jewish rule over them is the same as any other secular rule that they've lived under in the past, whether it's in Eastern Europe or in the United States. That's purely anecdotal. I don't have the answer to that.
Yeah, I've heard this before, also in my interaction, that the Haredi community has survived, or in some cases thrived, especially in Eastern Europe, by accepting their position, if you want to use the extreme, accepting their position under the Tsar. The Tsar was always seen as evil and terrible, therefore you had to make it work under them. And maybe subconsciously, many people in the Haredi community still see every other secular government, whether it's the American government or even the State of Israel, as an offshoot of that. We survive on our own, and we want to have nothing to do with the government of the day, because somewhere along the lines they're going to be oppressive on us. So that's, I might be a little bit extreme here, but I think that might be a subconscious way of the Haredim saying, look, we live here, we exist here, we just don't want to have anything to do with what's going on. Right. And I think that's a very sad existence, because using your example, we are in a different state. We're in a different state, literally, because it's a Jewish state, it is our state. And we're in a different situation because we are supposed to be responsible for one another. Like you said, a completely secular, unconnected Jewish kid from the US feels an obligation and a responsibility to the Jewish people, to the state he will come and draft. Yet an 18-year-old Haredi kid who's grown up here his whole life feels no responsibility to the rest of the country. That, I think, is a fundamental flaw in the system that the Haredim have created.
Right. And I don't think we, you and I, are going to solve that question here today. And I also don't think it's going to be solved in the near future. I think that's only something with time, that as we answer the other questions that I brought up, and as we start finding solutions, that is something that over time we can change. It also leads back into a much bigger question, which is, are we still in the diaspora? Are we in the times of the Galut? Or have we truly reached the Geula, where we're in a redemption now, where all of the Jews from around are starting to come back home, and we're collecting the shards of Judaism from around the world and bringing them back to one bigger piece? Some of those pieces take a little bit longer to fit back in to the pie. They've been disconnected for so long, it's hard to fit our family back together from all the shards that we got spread out with over the generations of the diaspora and the exile. And I think it's one of those things that time actually can heal and solve those questions.
Okay. I want to ask you one more question before we move on to the next issue. Is there is an opinion in the Haredi world that's often put out, is that their Torah study and their service to the community and the country. They sit and learn for us, and is the same as serving in the army, because they provide us with the spiritual energy and the spiritual shield that protects the country just as much as a soldier who serves in the front line. Now, I've got a lot to say on that, but I want to hear your opinion on that. Are you familiar with this opinion, and what do you think of it?
Of course I am. First of all, unfortunately, I'm not a prophet, and I'm not God, so I have no way of knowing if they're right or wrong. I can say that I have a very hard time believing that their spiritual pursuits on my behalf forget on my behalf, because I'm still a halachically orthodox, God-fearing, observant Jew. I have a hard time believing that their spiritual pursuits on my behalf have the purpose that they purport to have. I'll take it a little bit further. Forget for me, they won't agree with me, but they wouldn't be opposed to me on a personal level. They're men that I serve with. They're Jewish by birth. They don't follow any halacha. They don't live a Jewish lifestyle. They will definitely go out of their way even sometimes to do things that they know dafka are fundamentally wrong, like driving on Shabbat. Specifically, they have no need to, but they will dafka light a fire on Shabbat to show that they have no respect for it and don't care about it. I don't understand how a Haredi man sitting and learning Torah can really spiritually connect with this other soldier who's completely opposed to their entire existence. Now, let's say they can. Okay, let's say they're on such a high level that they can get over themselves. I'm not sure how that works if it's not a voluntary relationship. There's the question that comes down that one brother works, one brother learns, and they do it on each other's behalf. I support my brother who's learning, he's learning on my behalf. But that's a voluntary situation. This is involuntary. I'm not asking them to. And that already goes into discount the entire rest of the Torah observant learning world, all of the Orthodox Zionist religious Jews that are sitting and learning Torah all day. That goes to then discount all of the learning that's being done abroad on our behalf. I know I signed up there was a website at the beginning of the war where there were yeshiva students in America that were learning around the clock. You signed up with your Hebrew name, and there would always be someone 24 hours a day learning on your behalf, which when I then left Aza, I made sure to contact the person at the website. You can take me off the list. I'm no longer in danger, and so on and so forth. That existed for people that are living abroad that weren't connected. So I'm not sure where their spiritual pursuits come in. Not only that, there's no way to quantify it and check. If they wanted to create a level where they have 3 people learning, in 8-hour shifts for every soldier in Gaza and directly relate these 3 people to soldier X with a name, and then if something bad happens to that soldier, they should be informed. I'm not saying hold them responsible, but they should feel personal responsibility and guilt for the rest of their lives that the soldier that they were studying and learning Torah on his behalf was injured or, God forbid, killed. The same way I feel the personal responsibility for every soldier under my command who gets hurt or killed, and that will stay with me for the rest of my life. Now, I'm not being held responsible in a court of law. Shit happens in war. But there should be a level of accountability. If that argument is true, then they should have no problem going through with that accountability. I'm not the one who's going to address accountability to matters of the heart and spirit, but there needs to be something of back and forth.
I hear you. I like the way you spoke about something practical then, because I was going to bring in a different example. There's one of the things I think we're going to do throughout the show is we're going to break some myths about also Israeli society. Last week we broke a lot of myths about the army. So there is this idea that there are many Haredi Jews who are so dedicated to Torah study that they're learning 24/7. So I'm going to start off by breaking that myth, and why I disagree with what the premise that I brought up is. Not only are most of the guys in learning yeshiva are not learning 24/7, but in 3 weeks' time is going to be the Jewish commemoration of Tisha B'Av, right? The commemoration of the destruction of both temples and many other Jewish tragedies. Most people who've never been in yeshiva do not know that from Tisha B'Av until the 1st of Elul is what's called Bein Hazmanim in yeshiva. That means nobody's in yeshiva. It's semester break. You have a semester break for 3 whole weeks. Nobody is learning. Summer break. You have another semester break during the Chagim. Okay, that's all a little small period as well. And then you have another almost a month break just before Pesach. From Rosh Chodesh Nisan, yeshivot are off again. So there's this myth that, they're learning 24/7 and that's spiritual protection. It's not true. Okay, I think we should move on now to the second topic you wanted to speak about. So I'm going to open it like this. Let's say tomorrow, Haredim decide, okay, you're right, we're going to draft. And 30,000 Haredi boys pitch up at the draft office. Now what?
First of all, I think a lot of people would be in shock. So the question is how would you go about drafting them? There's already existing frameworks within the army. There's Netzach Yehuda, there's Rotem in Givati, there's Chetz and Tzanchanim, where all infantry combat units that are fully equipped already with glatt kosher meals, all-male staff of training officers and command officers, times on the schedule set aside for davening and learning on a daily basis, and they're comfortable places for ultra-orthodox men to draft to.
I just have to stop and explain, when you spoke about these different ultra-orthodox units, it's important to point out that they're actually relatively small. Within the Givati Brigade and the Tzanchen Brigade, we're only talking about one pluga. That's one company, which is, each one is maybe 100 guys. Mm-hmm. And even Netzach Yehuda, what used to be called Nachal Haredi, which is a Gudud, it's just a battalion. So that's maybe 500 to 600 guys. All these units that the army has set up are incredibly small in the grand scheme of things. We're talking about 30,000 soldiers, which is a whole different ballgame.
Exactly. So I was saying that there's frameworks. The model exists. The skeleton format for a framework for Haredi men to serve in combat units exists. There are other places within the intelligence and communications and programming that are even smaller. We're talking about, in the tens of men that exist also. These are very small frameworks that exist. The model exists. To expand that model, you'd think, okay, so it's one company, let's create 2 or 3 or 4. To expand that model much more than it already exists, it starts becoming exponentially more difficult as the framework gets bigger and bigger and bigger. A company to a brigade, company to a battalion is 3 to 1. There's 3 or 4 companies in a battalion. It's already a fairly simple framework. The second you go from battalion to brigade already, you start going now from hundreds to thousands of men, that framework becomes much more difficult. It needs to now just not include simple soldiers. It needs to now include more specialized forces. It has to include transportation and logistics and things that don't currently exist in those frameworks because they're small and they're piggybacking on the logistics, for example, of the larger body they're part of. So to expand them starts becoming exponentially more difficult. So the frameworks aren't there. Not only that, you need buildings and army bases, and you're talking about expanding the army itself, which again, this all takes time. It won't happen overnight. And that's not even starting to delve into the issue of the cultural norms and the expectations of these soldiers. They're going to be expected to be allowed to wear their beksha and their strimal on Friday night, at least to pray, if not the whole Shabbat, while they're in training. If there's no immediate need in combat, then why should I not be allowed to dress, for example, in my Shabbat garb for Shabbat? Or my cultural norms of I need 1 hour a day at exactly sunrise to pray morning prayers. Now, there's no immediate need for it in combat, so it's just training. So everything has to be fit around this schedule, and they're not going to just say, oh, it's not that important to me, I'll pray later on in the day. These are the fundamental values of their existence, and they're not small things. So the army has to be prepared already to start working with that, because again, a soldier who's conscripted by force to do something he doesn't want to do, that's not a useful soldier, especially not in combat. They're not going to be effective. You need to make them welcome and comfortable, and you do need to be more flexible with how we do things if that's the reality of what we need. Because you want them to be motivated. You can't create motivation from nothing. You can't turn an unmotivated soldier into a motivated soldier by yelling and screaming at them. It doesn't work. I've tried it. But that already now leads into our third question. Leads directly into it. What are the army's actual needs?
Right. So we've discussed that before, and I think this is an important distinction to make. What does the army need? Or more importantly, I think we can all agree, the army needs more soldiers. Would that be a fair statement? The army needs more soldiers.
I don't know.
Okay, so maybe that's the fundamental question we need to ask is, before we discuss all of this, is why is it important to draft the Haredim into the army?
Right. That's what we're trying to answer here. The question comes down to, is drafting the Haredim serving a technical manpower need of the army? Or is it serving a larger political, societal question of integration? Those are both valid questions and both valid missions, I guess you'd call them, of drafting Haredim, in my opinion. But the question is, what are the Army's actual needs? If the Army's actual needs are of manpower right now, like we need 60,000 soldiers tomorrow, or to fight the current war, we need highly trained infantry soldiers and tank soldiers right now. So, okay, where would we find those soldiers? Because if we now draft every Haredi man eligible for draft,
even if we have the facilities to bring in 30,000 soldiers tomorrow,
30,000 soldiers, and we have the facilities, they're all highly motivated, they're all exceptionally healthy, they're all mentally fit, they're all willing to accept the military hierarchy over them, everything, dream it up. It's still going to take 6 months to a year to train them. It's still going to take a year to 2 years to start training officers, even just at the platoon level. It's going to take an enormous amount of time to bring them up to the level of combat preparedness that people like you and I, we may be in our 40s, but you and I are already there, if not further. So the question comes down to, wouldn't it make more sense if there's an immediate need? Yes, the Haredi drafting is an issue on its own that needs to be discussed and properly planned out for the future. But our needs are right now, they're immediate. So where do we have reserves of soldiers to draft right now?
Do we have that? I think everyone can agree we need more trained soldiers now, but it takes 6 months to a year to train the soldiers we need, but we don't have that time. So where do we get those soldiers?
So the immediate question would be to turn to all of the different units, whether it's in the tank corps and the infantry, that have been either closed down in the tank corps because they don't have tanks, or in the infantry because they decided that we don't need them because we're not fighting any more big wars, and we went back, to a smaller and smarter army. So we decided to close down many infantry and tank brigades in the reserves. And we now have lots of soldiers who are out at home that are in their 30s that have no army units, that were never called up to draft because the units they were connected to were dissolved and they were just never drafted to somewhere else. Reopening those units, you could do in a matter of weeks. A guy who's in his 30s, who's still physically fit, who was trained and practiced for many years, within 2 weeks, you don't have to start from the very beginning of basic training. You hand him his rifle, you put him on the shooting range for an hour. It's like riding a bicycle. Yes, he'll need to, as we say in the army, he has to scrape off the rust. We have to take the rust off. It's a lorid chaluda. Right. It's saying every time we go back to train, the first day is just getting the rust off, reminding our muscles, the muscle memory, reminding ourselves how it's done. But we don't have to train from scratch. We have thousands of soldiers like that we can completely rebuild entire infantry brigades, if not divisions, out of, and especially in the tank corps. They're all readily trained and available, and they're eligible to be called back up to the reserves. We can call all of them up to fulfill an immediate need. It would also be a lot cheaper and faster. And then in the long term, we can create all of the frameworks for Haredi men to serve in to start fulfilling those roles in the long term. But what are the needs right now? The army hasn't answered that question.
Well, I think we discussed some of the failures of the army leadership in last week's episode, and here's, I think, another example of it. But it's not just the army, it's also the political echelons that haven't fully answered the question of what is the reason for drafting the Haredim. And I think that is something that I wanted to bring up, is there's the idea, a number of parties are claiming that drafting the Haredim is about, the Hebrew terminology is shivyon banetel, or equal burden. Now, I have a fundamental problem with that outlook. Military service, we both continue to serve in the IDF. Military service for me is an obligation, and more importantly, it's a privilege. It's a duty. The last thing I will ever call serving the IDF is a burden. And if your politics say we need to share the burden and therefore we have to draft Haredim, I think your starting point is wrong.
100%. I would even go further and call it an honor. I know that I still, to this day, I'm now 40, I've been doing this since 2004. Every time I put on my olive green uniform, which is not my favorite color, doesn't really fit that well, isn't that comfortable. Every time I put it on, I look in the mirror, my shoulders get a little bit square, my head gets a little straighter. There's a certain level of honor that I feel of the privilege of being able to wear that uniform every time I put it on. So it's not just a duty and a privilege, it's a deep honor that I feel to be able to protect the Jewish people.
Absolutely. Therefore, I think we have to change. As much as it's very easy for us to be critical of the Haredi outlook, and we already said, well, maybe they don't view themselves as part of the state, or they don't view themselves as part of the greater community, and they want to remain isolationist. At the end of the day, I think even within our own leadership, and that sometimes I think includes the Dati Leumi, or the national religious community, we need to find a way to include Haredim in the army and society in a way that comes across as we don't want to threaten you, firstly. And also, it's not about a shared burden. It's about a shared responsibility, or a shared, as you put it, a shared honor. And that, I think, is a very challenging way to present it, but it is probably a far more positive message also for ourselves.
Sure.
Ari, what do you think is a takeaway that we can do from this so that we can come to not necessarily a conclusion, but move forward with how do you see the Israeli society and the army moving ahead with us in a positive note?
So I think that I think that each side needs to call the other's bluff. I think that the army needs to bend over backwards to create every possibility on a technical level for the Haredi men to serve. And I think that the Haredi leadership needs to call the army's bluff and actually join the army. Because as has been proven already, that when the national religious, the Zionist Orthodox Jews started joining the army en masse and preparing properly for army service, they're slowly taking over a larger and larger percentage of the officer corps and attaining higher and higher ranks, and therefore more and more influence over the system itself. And I think that the Haredi community can do the same thing. You have extremely motivated, extremely strong men within the community who can become great leaders outside of the Beit Midrash, outside of the study hall. They can become great leaders within their own community, within their own frameworks, and over decades, which is a large amount of time in our perspective, but in history, just a blip on the radar. Over decades, they can start attaining higher ranks and therefore more influence over the system itself, where we can create a balance again. And moving forward, we can have a more Jewish army, a stronger army, a more inclusive army of the different parts of the Jewish world. And all of that can lead to greater success on the battlefield.
It's a wonderful way to finish off. Thank you very much, Ari, for joining me. And again, thank you to Tamil Dotal and Ala Mashmot for hosting us. That's all for this week. If you like this podcast, please like, subscribe, and share. We hope to be back next week with another episode.